Okay, welcome and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Jane Irrigation Training Series. I'm your host, Richard Restuccia, and today we're going to be talking about something that is sometimes hard for people to do. I know I have to push myself to do it, and it is post-season irrigation maintenance. And the reason I say it's hard to do is I've just sweated through a summer of landscape and or growing, and now I have to take that next step to prepare myself for next year when I just want to fall back in my big chair and take a rest because you feel like it's the end. You've crossed the finish line, but you haven't. The finish line isn't really crossed till you do this irrigation maintenance, and it makes a huge difference for next year. And I think that's really the important point. So when we looked at this, we said, how can we help our audience? How do we help our growers in being more successful? And the thing we thought about was, what are some steps you can take to make sure you're setting yourself up for success for next year? And Cory Broad, who's done a great job, especially on these technical trainings, a lot of the how-to, he's been super popular for it. And the reason why is he's super knowledgeable about all these things. When it comes to the technical side, he's a certified crop advisor, a certified irrigation designer, a certified ag irrigation specialist, a lifelong resident of the Central Valley, played some hockey at Fresno State, which he always loves to talk about, and I find very interesting. And most importantly about Cory is this is a guy who really cares about his customer success. And you can't say that about everybody in the business, but certainly we say it about Cory all the time because we've seen his success. I know we were taping some video of one of his customers earlier this week, and the guy taping the video said to me, the guy couldn't stop saying Cory's name. He was so happy with Cory. So Cory, I think that's a great testament to your success out there. Anyway, welcome and thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Richard. And again, as always, appreciate the kind introduction and the kind words. And, we don't have a business if we're not serving the people and the businesses and industries around it. And I'm really fortunate to work in a very diverse area of agriculture and work with a diverse type of number of producers. And so when you get to see these people be successful and you're walking through that journey, it's very powerful, and it's a lot of fun along the way too. And that's, I think, the most important aspect also.
Yeah, I agree. And, the other thing I think about our business, and I think our customer was saying this the other day, this is a relationship business. And when I hear that, I always try to take it to the next step. And I think that means it's a trust business. People buy things from Cory because they trust Cory to guide them in the right direction, not because they understand everything about the product you're telling them about, but because they know, they trust you, and they trust that you wouldn't recommend something that doesn't work for them. So I think you get that, and that's great to hear.
Absolutely.
So we're talking about post-season irrigation maintenance, and it's hard to believe today is October 1st. I can't tell where'd the summer go? But it is October 1st. And the first thing I did want to ask you is, Cory, how was the season?
I think it's been a difficult one. We're all probably seeing a lot of the articles online, no matter where you are in the world, about the drought in the Western United States and the impacts that that's had on communities, and the impacts it's obviously going to have on agriculture. And so certainly a tough summer. I believe in Fresno, it was the most triple-digit days in a calendar year. Obviously, I think we're done with those for now, thankfully. But just a tough season for producers to get through. Couple that with wildfires and some of the other events that have gone on. It's made things challenging for producers. But I think, as always, growers continue to innovate and invest in practices and technologies that make them better. But one of the reasons we're here is to talk about how to keep that efficiency going and how to maximize that investment. And that's why I felt like it was pertinent to talk about, with kind of the calendar change, as you pointed out, is even though in a lot of cases crops are off or out of the field, there's still a few things that we need to get wrapped up. And now is the time to get that done.
Yeah. So Cory, when you say now is the time, I'm thinking, do I have to do this next week, next month, or just before February?
Yeah, I would say there's no time like the present, but unless you're experiencing severe issues, it's probably something that doesn't need to be done on a Friday afternoon before everybody's weekend. But I think that we'll illustrate that a little bit throughout the presentation, that there are some opportunities that could really be maximized. And so really looking at the calendar, yeah, it's important, but sooner rather than later, but not today.
Yeah. Well, I'm hearing this sentence in my ears right now. If you don't have time to clean that tool right now, when are you going to have time to clean it? And we know what happens there. So
Absolutely. So kind of jumping into the recap of that and some of those points we just hit. If you notice in the top at the title of the slide, I put the end in quotations of a long season because there's still some things that need to be done, especially California agriculture seems to be a year-round machine. But we know that most of the Western US is experiencing drought, and most of our irrigation season, especially in California with a number of permanent crops that we have, it's going to commence in March, and then around this time, maybe into next month, kind of be the end of that season officially. And but there are other crops in California and Arizona that will continue to grow throughout the winter. You look at lettuce production, look at garlic, things like that, that'll continue to go. Most of our permanent crops will become dormant at some point here in the next 45 to 60 days. And so then that'll kind of stop irrigation there. To kind of put a number on it, what I could find online is that 94% of the Western US is experiencing some stage of drought. As you can understand, some are obviously significantly more impacted than others. And one of the key points about this time of year is that irrigation systems have been running, and in certain cases nonstop, it seems like, for several months. And so these small incremental issues that you talked about, not having time to clean that tool, well, maybe I couldn't take my irrigation system offline due to water availability and so on and so forth. So now would be the time to do that, to get prepped for next season. And like I said, maybe it's not today, but sooner rather than later. And what I hope to show is a few of the steps that you can take going through the process thoughtfully to help actually save you some time in that process.
Yeah, great point, Cory. We put our irrigation systems to the test in California this past year, and that's for sure. So if I'm thinking about that, what are some of the components of my system that maybe took it harder than others, or where I should be first checking?
Yeah, I think that really the filtration system always seems to be something that takes a lot of heat, pun intended, I guess, in the sense that it's really facing probably changing water quality. This year, when you start out the season in March, your water level's probably pretty good because not everybody's been pumping yet. Your water quality may be fair to good. And by this time, depending on what's gone on in that well, how much it's been pumped, what the strata from a water level standpoint is doing with neighboring wells, there's just so many conditions that change. And it actually changes pretty frequently. So I always say filtration's, obviously the best place to start because if there's an issue there, you're probably having issues downstream. But really kind of looking at what we need to focus on going forward. The emission devices are really at the end of the day what's putting the water out there. And so understanding what's going on in there, I think is important. But when I kind of talked about the season continuing, Richard, and I talked about there being opportunities, looking at this is an ET chart from the Almond Board of California, and zone 14 is where I am in Fresno right now. And kind of looking at that red circle that I put up there, these are ETC or crop consumption water use rates basically for the next 2 months. So depending on dormancy and exactly where you are, and of course the weather, which can always change, we're probably going to need to irrigate 5 inches of water, even though most of the almond crop has now been harvested at this point. One of my growers that we were discussing on our water management services is completely done. My other grower is halfway done, and he'll be finished this weekend. So the thought that, yeah, the crop is out of the field, but the trees are still there, the vines are still there, we still have to irrigate 5 inches. And so just to kind of lay an example for some of the framework of the presentation, if we have to do 5 inches And we have an application rate, which is fairly common, of 0.03 inches per hour, which is 13.5 gallons per minute per acre. That demand is going to require us to irrigate another 170 hours, which seems like a lot, and it is. But when you think about that over the next 2 months, it's not insurmountable. But the opportunity to start working on your irrigation system and not have to run it just to check on it, because it's already going to be running. That's really the point I'm making, is we're going to have to put this water on. So let's put it on and let's check our system while we're kind of putting the trees to bed, if you will.
Yeah, great points, Cory. And we already have a question coming in, and I just wanted to remind everybody that we do have the Q&A and the chat open. So if you have some questions you'd like me to ask Cory, I'll put them in there and I'll pass them on when appropriate. So our first question is asking about the weather in California, what the forecast is for 2022. Are we going to see more dry, hot weather, or are we going to see a break?
Well, if I was really good at predicting it, I'd probably have a lot more money in the stock market. But nonetheless, I would say there's been discussions about La Nina versus El Nino, and depending on what you subscribe to in that element, I don't think that the southern part of California is going to experience an overly wet winter. That's what I've read, what I've talked to people about. I think that maybe the northern part of the state, Oregon and Washington, could probably do okay. What I've come to understand, and I'm no climate scientist by any stretch, is a lot of that will depend on the jet stream. It sounds like the moisture is going to be there, but where the jet stream prevails will really determine where the moisture is going to fall. And to your point, Richard, earlier, living in San Diego, it's sunny. And when it becomes 68, people put beanies on. So it's not unheard of for us to be dry in the south and have more moisture in the north. So I'm not throwing it out there as to scare anybody, but I do feel like there will be some opportunities and also maybe some misses.
Yeah, and thanks, Cory, for that update. And I just want to plug Weather Talk again right now and just say, I think this is really fascinating, right? And talk about the weather isn't just for bored people.
No.
It really affects what we're doing day in, day out.
Yeah, it has a lot of impact on what we're going to do as a company, what we're going to do as an industry, what our growers are going to be able to do, and ultimately what the consumers can expect at the retail level on what's available and what price is that going to be at.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, back to this 5 inches of water over the next few months.
Absolutely. So we're going to go turn on that system. But if you have an almond crop, you've just ran shakers and sweepers and pickup machines through there. Yes, you have super talented labor. Everybody's very careful and nobody texts, I promise. This will happen. You will have issues in your orchard where things just get damaged, whether it's wear and tear or even just, like I said, harvest activities. So despite those best efforts, you're going to see it. This was a swivel tee, as you can see in the picture to the left-hand side, that half of it no longer exists. And so it does happen. And again, it's about being prepared for that and obviously identifying the issue and fixing it. So when we go through and we talk about operating this irrigation system to apply this water, look at the emitter line or tubing for nicks and cuts and spraying emitters, even missing segments. I've been out in fields before where 40 feet was gone because it got caught in a machine and the guy got out and cut it and threw it away somewhere and then just left it and didn't tell anybody. Micro sprinklers, obviously they get knocked over, the tubing gets yanked and they get pulled out of the ground, the barb connections can break. Riser connections that come out of the ground from your saddle, when there's tension put on the line, sometimes it can bend those, it can pull them back, create cracking. And then your flush outs are always targets on your end rows where you have an air vent and a PVC flush valve that are sticking 6 to 8 inches out of the ground. It's a prime target. So just kind of identifying those kind of big corrective issues in my mind is step one, because I guarantee you, again, as good as your guys are, there's probably going to be 1 or 2 issues out there. It just happens. Yeah,
it's really interesting to me, Cory, because oftentimes these go undetected. If you're not looking for it, the problem runs for a long time, causing problems. And, we had Stacy from Landscapes USA on last week, and her comment was 100% of the jobs I go on have some problem somewhere. It's just a matter of turning everything on and I find it.
Absolutely. And that's a valid statement from the ag side as well. I spend a lot of time in the field, and I've certainly spent a lot of time in the last 2 months. Like I said, getting these systems through the season, through the harvest, and then now into the period where we feel like we have some time and some opportunities with the weather, relinquishing some of the heat to get in there and make these fixes. And so with these fixes, of course, you have to have the material in order to do that. So for an almond grower, a grape grower, pistachio grower, here's a great list of things to have in your stockpile. I have almost all of this in my garage, so at least to some scale, because it's always good to have on hand, because you never know what problem you're going to encounter. And so hose couplers, obviously Power Lock from Jane is great. Our swivel tees, which we showed earlier, those can be damaged. An MST is just an adapter from basically single line drip to double line drip. Any of the mini ball valves that control those lines, so that when you are making a repair on the system while it's running, you can actually turn off that line and maybe you don't have to get sprayed, which for an irrigation guy, I don't like being wet. So that's something that's always recommended. I talked about that IPS flex hose. If you have a couple cut lengths, like I said, if there's a damaged section to it, you can dig out a little bit, make a cut, and just put a coupler in with the segment. Air vents, so they're sticking out on those flush outs, and if they get damaged, you can just thread one off and thread one on pretty easy. Emitter line or tubing, depending on what your application is, to have a spare roll or two of that around. Your drippers, if you have button drippers on your hoses, those, they get knocked off by equipment. They get knocked off by field personnel sometimes walking through and tripping over them. Same thing with sprinklers. They get damaged, they get stuck, they get ripped out. PVC glue, in case you have to make a PVC repair. Don't forget the primer for that glue, and then the clear glue for IPS. So if you're doing a vinyl IPS riser into a PVC fitting, like a socket MHA or a saddle, you need clear glue for that for proper fusing. Teflon tape to put all your fittings together so they don't leak on the bases of air vents, so on and so forth. They see that mistake made a lot also.
What a great list, Cory. I was checking off what's in the back of my truck right now, and I see a few items that I need to add. Now, one person's asking, I think it's an interesting question for a couple of reasons. One, they're saying, if I live in a major pest area, vertebrae, coyotes, that thing, is there something more I should have of one or the other? And then I just want to add to that, is there anything that can be done about these pests?
Yeah, it's a challenge. In my, I'll say, past life, when I was in college, I worked for a pest control company doing integrated pest management, IPM. And what I really like about IPM is it's really looking at multiple ways. So it's not just like a physical control or just a chemical control, but it's a mix of all these avenues. So don't make it habitable. Look at physical eradication and control. Look at tactics that make them not want to be there. And so I think that's really the important approach, especially if you're dealing with like mice, things like that. Owl boxes are great, but even the other day, somebody posted an article I saw online on how to maintain your owl box. So you put an owl box out there, you got to maintain that too, which is great. But you're creating a predatory control there. When you're talking about the products used, obviously couplers are probably number one, along with the sections of the proper hose or supply tubing to fix those areas that are damaged. And I see a mistake a lot where people don't buy the right product on kind of that repair kit because a dealer or distributor doesn't have exactly what they need, and that dealer didn't really work with them to make sure that they're getting what they need. They just say, well, it's this size. Okay, well, what's the flow rate? What's the spacing? Try and do your best to match those to your system. Even if it's a lower flow rate dripper, well, if it's a tighter spacing between the drippers and that matches up, that could be acceptable. But ideally, you'd want to have something that's standardized. That's why a lot of our dealers do work off of, in agriculture, maybe a 0.5 gallon per hour at 24 inch or a 1 gallon at 36 inch, something like that, so that it's readily available for them. And we do, I think, a good job at Jane to make sure that we have some of those products around for, as we say, the onesies, twosies that are needed this time of year.
Yeah. Thank you, Cory. Appreciate that answer.
Absolutely. So you talked about where to start earlier, Richard, and I kind of gave you a little bit of a runaround answer, and I said the filter is a good place. Well, we're actually going to get to a filter in another presentation that we're going to do on kind of a second part of this that's a little bit more in depth. But one of the real avenues I think that we push in the industry, but maybe doesn't happen enough, and it's something that we do as part of our water management service before we even enroll a customer into our program, is performing a DU test. And doing it right after harvest, especially in permanent crops, is great for many reasons. We talked about irrigating for another 170 hours. Well, if you do it right after harvest and I still have to put this water on, I'm not telling you, Richard, hey, let's do a DU test, but it's December and I know you don't want to pay PG&E or your utility any more money, but I need you to go run your system for a couple hours. The system's already going to be running. And also we're putting on that 5 inches. We want to make sure that we're getting the right amount on. So great timing opportunity. Those corrective actions that are maybe larger than just those physical damages that we showed earlier that are, I'd say, easily identified. This can be done all long before next season. And then the really large issues, which are maybe mainline issues, pump sizing issues, large scale filtration problems, those management plans can really be created and discussed with your distributor, your dealer, long before we get into the installation season, which is when, the off season, quote unquote, is when the dealers are very busy. Well, if we wait and wait and wait, they may be busy trying to get people water for their new plantings or new projects. And now you're stuck with, well, do you have water? Yeah. Okay, well, I'll get to you when I can, Richard. And so I think getting ahead of that curve is really important in giving you the best opportunity to be successful and experience really the best service. So performing a DU test is a really simple way to go about it. And doing a global DU test, which is what we find from like the ITRC handbooks, is great, but it can also be challenging from the standpoint of if you haven't done one before, or you don't have enough help or labor to really do it in a reasonable time frame, consider even doing a modified or rapid DU, which I just recommend to growers. Just this is something that I think, in my opinion, just about everybody can do on their system. And really, it looks just like this map presents, which doesn't show maybe a ton without any context, but consider you're just going and taking 36 flow measurements and pressure measurements across your field in areas of varying pressure. So far away from the pump, close to the pump, before a valve, after a valve, so on and so forth, and create this map of variability from the high, medium, and low pressure areas. With this, we can compile this data. It probably gives us some pretty good insights. And now we can say, wow, where is my issue? Is it downstream of that valve? Okay, well, maybe the valve is the issue. Nope, the valve's fine. Okay, then let's go down to this next segment. It helps us start narrowing down the areas that are affecting our irrigation system.
Yeah. So then my next question on this, Cory, is, well, so what? What if it's different pressure, or what if it's different flows?
Perfect. Then you're going to lead me right into where I want to go next. So I put some circles in here to kind of, again, talking about areas of variability.
So, by the way, this is unrehearsed.
Which is the best part. Distribution uniformity, the average of the low quarter values divided by the average of the field. And we're going to go through this. So it seems obscure at first if you've never seen it, but we talked about taking 36 sample measurements. As you can see, this is when I was out in the field, literally have some plastic cups and a graduated cylinder, some pressure gauges and so on, getting these measurements physically out there. If you have 36, you take the average of the 9 lowest flows, the low quarter, and just for conversation's sake, let's pick 46 milliliters because that's what the graduated cylinder was measured in. And then you take the average of all 36 samples. So again, for example, let's pick 61. 46 divided by 61, your DU is 0.75. Now, where this really hits home on the so what part is I told you needed to irrigate 170 hours to put on those 5 inches. If you're accounting for distribution uniformity, making sure that basically your field is being covered by that amount down to the farthest, most impacted area, you use it as a divider. I now need you to irrigate 226 hours. With electricity at 19 cents a kilowatt hour and labor at $17 an hour and so on and so forth. So that's where this impact comes. And probably more importantly, and I know we've discussed it in other webinars and other avenues before, if your DU is 0.75, well, that was just for 5 inches is 226 hours. If you had a tree crop that took 44 inches this year, how much more extra irrigation are you now applying? How much more energy are you expending, labor, so on and so forth, just to produce the same crop?
Yeah, wow. So Cory, where should that DU be? How high should it be?
We did a test on one of our new installations about a month ago, and we had a 0.93. I think out of the box, 0.92 and up is really where I would like to see it. Because the reality is, just like an automobile, it doesn't stay at that same efficiency. Even with the best maintenance, you could keep it close, but over time it just changes. The efficiency decreases. So if you're driving at 35 miles to the gallon today, in 20 years, it won't be the same. And so when you start falling down below an 8.5, an 8.8, I think you really need to start looking at why are we getting there? And if that's in 2 years, that concerns me. If that's in 10 years, okay, that I can understand that. But out of the box, 9.2, 9.3, I think that's very realistic. So for easy math, just say 9.0.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
So again, just showing you what I did. Again, it can be very obscure, but I just drew a map of a field. I picked areas of variability. And those materials on the left-hand side, I have in my truck 24/7. It's probably $50 worth of material max. And with that and Microsoft Excel and a stopwatch, I can find something that's going to impact tens of thousands of gallons of water, hundreds to thousands of pounds of crop, and anything in between by just some simple calculations and a great starting spot. So as I showed earlier, I drew a box around I just sorted the column with the flows in it, which is the right-hand column of the long columns. So took those 9, I averaged it. I averaged all of them. That's all it is. You plug it right into Excel. And you don't even need Excel if you're willing to just do it by hand, but Excel makes it certainly easy. So what I really want to illustrate is that this can be done in a time-efficient manner. And you don't have to be a certified irrigation designer and all those other acronyms to go and perform this. If you need help, you can reach out. There are tons of people between your extension systems. Here at Jane, we'd be happy to talk to you about it, to help you go down this path. Because again, we want you to understand where your efficiency is at, because you can make better irrigation decisions based on that information.
So Cory, in this example, you've got a problem with your first 3 areas.
Absolutely. And just so you know, I randomly put these numbers in. I just started typing the other night and wanted to build the example. So that's where I ended up with 41 and 61 and a DU of 0.75. Certainly some issues. So what is the issue? Well, the issue is obviously that water is not coming out of that emission device at the same rate as most of the field that we would expect or have recorded. So why is that happening? Well, you look at those PSI numbers that are next to it, they may be lower than the average pressure in the field. So it could be a pressure related issue. Then you start going through the steps and say, okay, is it low pressure because of a valve? Is it low pressure because the pump is less efficient than it was 6 months ago? Is there blockage in the line? Is it just plugging in the emitter? There's so many different things that can cause it. And that's where some of maybe the more technical expertise would come into play. I would say 9 times out of 10, you go and you find this information and you plot it out on that map, you start to see very quickly where the issue is. I showed you a 20-acre block earlier. You could narrow it down into a few acres probably pretty quickly.
Yeah, and that was my point I wanted to make was, and at least you know where the problem is.
And that's the first step, because when you're looking at, especially in agriculture, large tracts of land that are covered in trees, it's kind of hard to see through. And the evidence of an issue is maybe not staring you right in the face. So really understanding where that's located is the first step. And our satellite imaging, we use it all the time with our customers. It's a great step throughout the season to start finding where these problems are. Because if you see a change in, say, tree vigor, well, that tells you that in that area, there's some level of an issue. And most of the time, it's actually pretty small. It can be pretty simple, but it gives you a place in a 20, a 40, 160 acres to basically drive straight to, look around, and most of the time, again, in 5 minutes, it's something very simple.
Yeah. So Cory, we have a question coming in, and it's the question is, would the lower PSI cause the problem? Is that what the issue is? Is the low, if you always have low pressure, you're going to have low flow?
Not necessarily. So again, this is just an example where I was literally randomly typing in 2 columns just to build this example. But I would say that this example probably exists in somebody's field, and probably more than one person's field from my experience. And that's okay. Again, it's about identifying it and finding it. If you had, say, pressure compensating emitters that were maintained properly, this wouldn't be an issue, because pressure compensation, especially from the Jane family of products being Top Drip or Amnon in our emitter line program, those have an operating range of 7 to 58 PSI. So 12, 18, and 21, that would be flowing just fine. So you wouldn't see that correlation there. Now, if you had, if you had non-comp or sprinklers, for sure.
Yeah, glad you brought up that pressure compensation. That's really the secret, right? Or important to have.
Yeah, it's a big step. It's a great technology, and its use has grown significantly in the industry, and that's great. But if we're not maintaining those products, or we're not maintaining all the valves and filters upstream of them, we can't rely on them to be successful. So we talked about that pressure map, and collecting all that data, again, allows you to diagnose where the problem is. Areas of low pressure and or low flow from your samples, again, as somebody just pointed out by looking at a simple chart, not even a map, that caught their interest. That's great. Now we need to go find where those are. So again, record them on your map and go to those areas and see what's going on. Another great opportunity is to supply that information to the irrigation dealer that services that system, that designed it, hopefully is involved in the maintenance program of it, so that they can give you additional insight. You don't have to be the expert. That's what we're here for. And there's a network of certified professionals that are here to help you. But if you go and you get that information, you say, this is what I'm seeing, they should be able to help you find an answer in a timely manner, in a cost-effective manner, because you've done most of the legwork in a short period of time. And now a narrowed, focused effort can be done to make it better. I also included at the bottom our friction loss calculator, which is on our website. It's a great tool. I use it all the time. And I bring that up because you can see here in the pressure gauge, this is a field I was in a couple months ago where I had 12 pounds of pressure. Well, when I went to the end of the line, I had like 3 pounds of pressure, maybe. And when I punched in the specifications of the run length and the tubing, it shouldn't have been losing as much pressure as it was. Well, come to find out, there were some blockages inside the tubing where sediment had built up over time, reduced the surface area or the inside diameter of inside the tubing. Therefore, it was burning extra pressure. Naturally, I would have said, wow, this whole line's bad. It was probably a 30-foot section. Those are the kind of things that by understanding what your performance measures should be, you can easily say, wow, at the head end, it's X, then at the tail end, it's Y. The difference should be 4, should be 3, so on and so forth. When it's higher than that, that's when you go, okay, I need to look a little bit closer.
Yeah, eventually you saved your customer a lot of money when you discovered that too.
2 couplers and 40 feet of tubing. So versus that crop that wasn't being sufficiently irrigated for 310 feet.
Yeah.
So pretty straightforward, but again, just a little tips and tricks there. This is just kind of again, another way to really look at some of these problems. So if you're standing at your filter station and you see low pressure, like we're seeing on the left-hand side there, and a high flow rate, hopefully you have a flow meter. If you don't, please install one. It's really, really helpful in the troubleshooting process. And probably you're having field leaks if you have low pressure and a high flow rate. So that could be a broken pipe underground out in the field, could be a broken valve that's allowing water to go somewhere that maybe it shouldn't, could be just damaged emitter line and sprinklers. And now to get significantly high flow rates, you have to have a lot of damage like those T's that we saw earlier, but it does happen from time to time. If you're standing at the filter station and you have high PSI and a low flow rate, you probably have plugging out in your field. Your emission devices are not putting out as much as they need to. Therefore, it's creating excess pressure upstream of those devices, but also could be a closed valve. Maybe it's supposed to be a single set system and somebody is running it in 2 sets where they closed off half the field, something like that. If you're in the field and you have low pressure, you could have filter plugging. You could have a low flow from the pump where it's not creating obviously the volume that's needed for the system. So kind of leads into a pump issue overall. Or again, maybe you have another valve open. Maybe it's supposed to be ran in half and half and somebody forgot to close the other valve and now the whole field's running. Conversely, if you have high pressure in the field, could have that valve closed. You could also start seeing plugging as well. So that's just a very general kind of roadmap to look at there. Again, it's not the answer to all issues, but it's certainly a place to start, and certified professionals should really help you narrow that down, especially with that pressure map that we talked about earlier. So with that, I think that really concludes a lot of what we wanted to cover today. I know you and I had discussed, Richard, about doing a second version of this where we're going to go a little more in depth on some of the components of the system, i.e. filter stations, et cetera. And so I'm really looking forward to that and really helping people. But I think that this is a great step, because if you go and you have that DU information, now you can leverage that maybe with some topics from our next talk to say, okay, here's how I'm going to implement these fixes.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cory. That's a great idea, right? Get out there, do your DU test, do your pressure test. And if you have some troubleshooting questions or you want some help with this, contact Cory. Everything looks good. You can watch his next webinar on filter stations and maintenance of those, as well as lines, and step through this in a really methodical, good process. So thank you, Cory, for putting this together for us. Really appreciate it. Look forward to you coming back. I want to say thank you to everybody who tuned in today. We really appreciate your support. We hope we're hitting the mark for you on the education. Remember, all our trainings are on janesusa.com/trainings. They're all free. It's coming to the end of the year. Many of them are approved for CEU credits with the Irrigation Association. So we hope you take advantage of that. Again, thanks everybody. Thank you, Cory. Hope everybody has a good weekend, and we'll see you back here next week. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.